Hello everyone, my name is Robbie and welcome to the first episode of the From Day One podcast. This is a new podcast that I'm obviously just starting because we're in episode 1 and I'm really just testing out all the equipment, making sure it works and using this opportunity to introduce myself, who I am, what my plan is with the podcast and why I started the podcast. So I'll just get straight into it. Who am I? My name is Robbie. I am a business manager for a packaging company. We deal mainly with whiskey companies and gin companies, basically the spirits industry in general. And in my spare time, I invest in the stock market, invest in cryptocurrency, property, whiskey, watches. I invest in various things. I like to try and diversify my portfolio, and I try to document that on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. So I make YouTube videos about mainly the stock market and property, occasionally crypto when I'm losing money. So after starting a TikTok profile, basically talking about business and finance during lockdown to keep myself occupied, give myself a little hobby on the side, I decided once I gained a little bit of a following, maybe 10, 15,000 followers, I thought maybe a YouTube channel would be quite cool. So started that. That's at around 1,300 subscribers just now. And I've always had the idea of starting a podcast in my head years before I started doing anything on TikTok or posting on social media about anything. I just thought it would be cool because I like to meet interesting people. I do speak to interesting people on a regular basis, and some of the conversations we have would probably be beneficial to other people to hear as well, about business, about their stories and how they've become who they are. So I thought now that I've garnered a bit of a following online, it's probably a good time to start a podcast if I really wanted to do it. So here I am. Why have I called it From Day One? So basically I want to hear people's stories from day one. My favourite podcasts, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and my favourite ones are always the podcasts about people's stories, how they got to where they are. So it's nice to hear. I'm not interested in hearing a podcast with someone like Elon Musk, for example. It just seems too far-fetched to really grasp. However, if you listen to episodes of the Scottish Property Podcast, for example, they interview people who have sizable property portfolios, smaller portfolios. It's interesting to hear how the person maybe got their first property, rolled some money into the next one, and built a bit of an empire, for example. There's also podcasts who interview small business owners, large business owners, finance people, comedians. A podcast can cover any genre of person. So I always find it interesting to hear how the person went from normal person, like you or I, to super successful in whatever it is they do, if it's comedy, if it's social media, entrepreneurship, whatever. So that's why I've called it the From Day One podcast, because I want to hear the story from day one, and day one can be interpreted however they like. It can be interpreted as from day one being born and talking through their childhood and growing up and things like that, or from day one of starting the restaurant that they now own, or starting the investment company that they run, or whatever it is that they do. So I briefly touched on why I started the podcast, but I'll go over it again because I've got it noted down here. I've got a little note here that I'm trying to use to keep myself on track, because this is different to YouTube. YouTube, I can cut things out and I can edit things. I want to try and keep this as raw as possible. There will be a few cuts here and there to cut out the M's and A's and points like this where I'm being too quiet. But I'll go through my notes. So basically I started this, or want to start this podcast for selfish reasons really. I like meeting interesting people. I like speaking to interesting people. It's nice. It's always cool hearing people's stories. So sometimes you see on Instagram or LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever, someone posts a photo of their new Ferrari, or someone's just bought a new Rolex or whatever, and I wonder to myself, I always have wondered to myself, how does that person have that and I don't, like a Ferrari? How did that person get to that point? I've always wondered that with numerous people, and sometimes you see podcasts with people and they talk about these things, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes they maybe haven't been invited on a podcast, or they might not want to be portrayed on social media. They might want to keep themselves to themselves. But I always want to know, how did that person get there? What did they do? What steps did they take to achieve what they've achieved? If it's a nice house, if it's a cool car, if it's a successful business, whatever it might be, how did you get that? I figured because the content that I already post is business and finance related, I figured a lot of my followers would maybe be interested in that as well. So rather than me just speaking to the people, which I do, I speak to quite a lot of people on Instagram or in person, go for coffees and things like that, and I hear the stories, but I'm sure a lot of the followers would find the stories interesting as well, and there's always useful things in these conversations. If you have a conversation with a business owner, you could be talking about anything and the conversation just flows towards something useful that you take away, something that just gets stored in the back of your mind that you might use one day. So if I'm going to be talking to these people now and again anyway, I might as well record it and let other people get an insight into how these people think, how they operate, advice, all of these sorts of things. Also, on another selfish note, because I find these people interesting, I want to speak to them. It's not purely for entertainment for you to find out this information. It's also, selfishly, I want to get in a room with these people and I want to find this information out for myself as well. So it's twofold. It's helpful for me, it's helpful for you, it's threefold. It's also helpful for the person who comes on the podcast once it gains a bit of traction. If the podcast has a couple thousand followers, it could be helpful for someone. It could be helpful for someone to come on the podcast to promote whatever it is they do. If it's a restaurant, if it's investment, if it's a shop, if it's an online business. So it's threefold. It helps me, it helps them, and it helps you. It's a win-win-win in my eyes. So, as I mentioned, I've wanted to start a podcast for years, probably since around 2015 or 16. My fiance, she was my girlfriend at the time, she's now my fiance. She used to live city centre of Edinburgh, so I used to go into Edinburgh against the commute every couple nights. But it would still typically take me an hour and a half to get from my house in West Lothian or my work in West Lothian into Edinburgh. And I would always listen to podcasts, and I always thought, I could do this. I think I could develop decent interview skills and interview these people for a podcast. I think that would be cool. I knew interesting people. I knew interesting people who knew other interesting people, if that makes sense. So I thought I could probably get a handful of cool people to come on this podcast to sort of kickstart it. I had a list of people at the time that I thought would have been cool to interview. So it was local business people, there was property entrepreneurs, some social media influencers that were, maybe they had 5 or 10,000 subscribers at the time, YouTubers. So for an example would be Joe Delaney, the fitness YouTuber, but he doesn't just post about fitness, he sort of talks about everything. I followed him online. I think he maybe had 15,000 followers when I first started watching his YouTube videos. I think he's probably on about 400,000 or something maybe now. So if, for example, if I could have tried to get him on a podcast at the time, it would have been a lot easier to get him on if he had 15, 20,000 subscribers than it would be now at 400,000. There was gaming YouTubers, there was comedians, business people who all were smaller then than they are now, obviously. So the likelihood of getting them on the podcast now is obviously more difficult. There is also the aspect of the sooner you start, the better you can become at something. So if I'd started doing this podcast in 2016, 6 years ago, if I'd stuck at it until now, could have been quite a big podcast. I would have been good at interviewing people because this is my first foray into that. So it might be a bit choppy for a couple of episodes until I really get used to it. It might not. It might come really easily. It might not. I don't know. But there was one person that stands out in my brain that makes me kick myself that I didn't start a podcast when I wanted to. There's a guy who is from West Lothian and he's a musician. So years ago, there was quite a big music scene in West Lothian. Places like Bathgate would have gigs on every weekend, and places like Room at the Top Harley's, was that what it was called? There was Livingston. You would go to gigs at like the Harvester and Knightsbridge, and there was a good music scene in West Lothian, and all the same people would always be at the same gigs. And there was this guy who sometimes he would have to be brought in to the pub to do his show, and then he would have to leave because he was too young to be there. And his name was Lewis Capaldi. I knew his big brother. I spoke to Lewis a handful of times at gigs and things like that, but I knew his big brother quite well. We used to talk to each other at the skate park quite a lot, and I had a band at the time, and sometimes we would play in the same places. We sort of operated in the same social circles because he might not be playing, but he would come to some gigs that I was also at and things like that. At the time, I thought it would be cool to interview him because I thought he's a good singer, obviously. He's talented, and I think he might, if he sticks at it, he could probably, not to the extent he is now, but I thought he could probably be quite famous in Scotland, like a Scotland level of fame. So I thought that would be pretty cool because I think he's talented. I think he probably has some interesting stuff to say. It'd be interesting to hear his point of view, and it's one of those things, if you can get someone on like your podcast, for example, earlier, it's cool to look back on. So at the time I was like, oh, that would be cool, and then I never started the podcast. This was in 2016. I don't even think he'd released Bruises yet. I think Bruises went onto Spotify. I think Bruises was the thing that propelled him into not superstardom like he is now, but got him that leg up into where he is now. That was before that. There's a clip on YouTube. I don't even know if it's still on YouTube. He was singing a song called Submarine, and it was like somewhere, I think it was called Submarine, and he was singing it down somewhere like near the beach on like a seaside town or something like that, and I used to listen to it all the time. I was like, this guy's good. This guy's really good. So I always thought that would have been cool. And then every time I seen him get a little bit more successful, I thought, should have started that podcast, and I should have tried to see if he wanted to. He might not have even came on it. He might have said, no, I don't want to be in a podcast. He might have though, and we'll never know. We'll never know if he would have. But there's so many examples of people that I could have tried to get in a podcast 6 years ago when I decided that I wanted to do one, and then I never done anything with the idea, and I'm kicking myself for it, because even if just a handful of them would have come on, it would have been cool. So here I am now trying to make amends for that, because I think I would kick myself forever if I didn't start one eventually. I've been saying it for a year. From today, I've been saying it for a year that I'm going to start a podcast. I've had 2 microphones ready to go, and then just other things got in the way, other work things, and then making the YouTube videos takes up my time and my spare time, so I didn't want to add another thing, but I sort of did want to add another thing in the form of a podcast. So here I am. I've started it now. This is episode 1. This is for 2 reasons, this episode. 3 reasons. 1, to introduce myself in case someone comes along that they don't know who I am, which is unlikely, because it's probably just going to be people on my Facebook that see this, like people that I know personally that are going to see this one, but hopefully in future it'll grow. 2, to help me try and get to grips with the equipment and make sure that everything's working right. It's sort of like a dummy run to make sure it all works right before I interview someone and the camera messes up, the microphones mess up, something goes wrong. This is to prevent that from happening. And what was the third reason? Me trying to use the equipment, introducing myself, and sort of giving myself a kick up the arse to actually do it. If I film this first episode and I upload it, I'm obligated to continue it. I need to then go and start filming ones with people now that I've done this one. So, episode 1 of who knows how many. I've got a few guests. I've got a handful of potential guests that I've spoke to provisionally who said, yeah, I'd be up for that. I can think of 3 off the top of my head just now that all were up for coming on, but some of them I did ask quite a while ago, so we'll see if they're still up for it. But that is it. A quick short one. I'm planning on making the episodes around an hour long, hopefully. It'll just be me and any guest that I get on for now. Maybe one day I'll have like a sort of co-host or something. Who knows? I think having a co-host would help with weeks that you don't have a guest. You can just have a conversation about whatever's been happening that week or whatever. But right now, it's just me and whoever I manage to get on. So I don't think I'd like it to be a weekly podcast, but for the time being, it'll probably be every 2 weeks, maybe every 3 weeks, depending on time, arranging guests and things like that. But hopefully you'll stick around. Hopefully you subscribe to the channel if you're watching this on YouTube. I'm going to try and put it out on all the platforms that are available. But if you're watching this in video format on YouTube, subscribe to the channel because I will be posting semi-consistently until I can get some sort of consistency and guests and things like that. But I won't take up any more of your time. This has been episode 1 of the From Day One podcast. Episode 2 coming hopefully in a week or two. Thank you for watching, listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow on whatever platform you're listening to. I don't know if you can follow on different platforms. I'm figuring this shit out. Thank you for listening. See you in a bit.